So I currently teach a class on sex crimes policy and practice, and I've been teaching this class intermittently for about 6 years. And on the first day of class, I always ask students, what is a sex offender and what are the laws that we should use to combat sexual violence? And typically the responses that I get are these are sick, vile individuals who really deserve no mercy and who really deserve really harsh legislation because that's going to stop them from offending. And so that's what I'm going to talk to you about tonight, the impact of sex crimes legislation that we have. And then I'm going to finish it off talking about whether or not these laws actually do anything for survivors of sexual violence. So Washington State was actually the first state to have modern registration and notification laws. How many of you have ever heard of registration and notification, or Megan's Law? So this law was passed in 1990 after two pretty serious, heinous crimes with Wesley Allen Dodd and Earl Shiner. And so from this came, as I said, the first modern registration and community notification law, and also sexually violent predator civil commitment statutes, which meant that the state of Washington can indefinitely commit somebody to a mental institution if they are a really big danger, a really big risk to the community. So this is really the impetus for federal legislation. And so picture over there is Jacob Wetterling. He was abducted while riding his bike with his brother and a friend in 1989. His body has never been found, but from this case stemmed federal legislation. So it started here in Washington State and then moved to federal legislation. So the Jacob Wetterling Act is federal registration. And so this act required every state to create a sex offender registry, but that was typically only used for law enforcement. In the year that the Jacob Wetterling Act was passed federally, 7-year-old Megan Kanka was lured into the home of a registered sex offender, a repeat sex offender who lived across the street from her family, and she was raped and murdered. And her parents felt that if they had known that a registered sex offender lived across the street from them, that they could have protected her. So federally, Megan's Law was put into place in 1996, and this amended the Jacob Wetterling Act. And so together, this is sex offender registration and notification, but we often just talk about it as Megan's Law. States were given pretty broad latitude as to how they could enact these laws, and so what that meant was that states have different registration requirements. People have to register for different amounts of time. Different people are on the registry for different crimes. And how we delineate risk of reoffending differs by state. By 2003, every state in the country had an internet sex offender registry, but again, the information that was on those registries varied by state. So in 2006, the federal government passed the Adam Walsh Act, which seeks to standardize across all of the states, so to allow for some consistency across all of the states. So the justification for sex offender registration and notification policies is really to keep children safe from dangerous repeat offenders. And they're enacted after these really heinous, vile cases, like all of the cases that I've just shown you. And so part of the public discourse that has stemmed from these very heinous cases are statements like this, that we have these thousands of missing sex offenders. We don't know where they are. They're really dangerous. If we have these policies and we're controlling and monitoring these people, we can keep our communities safe. Just by knowing these people are around are going to keep us safe. And if we just keep sex offenders out of our communities, children won't be harmed. So for about 10 years, my research has really been focused on whether or not claims like this are true, whether or not sex offender registration and notification policies are effective, and really what the national picture of sex offenders looks like. So this is the most recent map that was put out by the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. They put this out every 6 months, and it's an estimation of the number of registered sex offenders in the United States. So as of December of 2014, it is estimated there are just over 819,000 registered sex offenders in the United States and its territories. But this number is sort of misleading. So for instance, if you look at Washington State, it lists 21,000 registered sex offenders, but Washington State only has 5,000 registered sex offenders on its public registry. And that's because Washington State has deemed 5,000 people dangerous enough or at risk enough that the community needs to know, and about 15,000 people that are low risk. The state of Florida lists 65,000 people on its registry, but only 23,000 actually live in the state, that are actually in the community. Minnesota has 17,000 offenders listed on their registry, but only about 300 or less are on their public registry. So this sort of distorts reality. There may actually be 819,000 sex offenders, but there's no real way for us to delineate who we should fear and who we should be afraid of and who we should watch out for. So NCMEC, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, has been putting out this map for many years, but no researcher had looked at a national portrait of this population. And so my colleagues and I worked to download, or what we call scrape, all of the public registry data in 2009. And the first publication that came out of that was in 2011, where we found that only about 66% of people that are estimated by NCMEC are actually on public registries. And of those, only about 88% are actually living in the community. I think the two most salient points that we took from this study, the claim that there are 100,000 missing sex offenders, we could not substantiate across any of the work that we've done. If you include everybody that is homeless, everybody that is transient, and all of the people that have absconded or are non-compliant, we still don't reach 20,000 people. And so that's a number that's been thrown across the media for years, and no research has found that that is the case. And I'd like to say that most of the presentation tonight, I'm talking about my own research and the research that I've done with my colleagues, but this work is aligned with everything else that's in the field. The findings are very much the same. So whether or not we scrape the data from registries or we call states and ask them about their numbers, which is the study on the bottom, the findings are the same. There are a lot of people that are estimated by NCMEC that are not on public registries. And the most important point from all of this research is that less than 5% of the people that are on public registries are the people for whom these laws were originally intended for. So overall, that body of work finds still great differences by state, by who is captured on registries, what information is available about those individuals, and even the terminology that we use by offense. And so what we conclude from that is that the Adam Walsh Act has really failed. And primarily that's because only 16 states are in compliance with Adam Walsh, because this federal law does not take into account best practices. So what we know about the registered sex offender population and what we know from the research actually works to stop victimization and to monitor people in the community effectively, states understand that this is not working and so have elected not to comply with Adam Walsh. And in a few slides, I'll actually show you what has happened with how Adam Walsh seeks to define risk. So they have moved to offense-based classification systems, which means that people are considered high risk or low risk based on the crime that they're convicted of, as opposed to any actuarial or clinical assessment of dangerousness. In addition to that, as I said, there are a lot of people that are on registries, but that are not on public registries, and that really mischaracterizes this population, and it makes a lot of us live in fear. That's really unnecessary fear. So this is the makeup of the Ohio Sex Offender Registry prior to moving to Adam Walsh. And what you see here is that about 61% of people on the registry pre-Adam Walsh were considered low-risk offenders. So sexually oriented offenders are low risk. 20% were sexual predators, and 3% were habitual offenders, meaning they had more than one offense. This is what happened post-Adam Walsh. 56% of people automatically became high-risk offenders. This is Oklahoma pre-Adam Walsh. 61% of people on the Oklahoma registry were considered low-risk, non-aggravated, non-habitual offenders. This is what happened post-Adam Walsh. 82% of people on the registry are now considered high risk. And so it makes us question what the definition of risk is. And it makes it really, really difficult for people who are going on to public registry sites to determine whether they or their families are at risk, to determine if they really are. In addition to registration and notification, we have residence restrictions, which mandate where sex offenders can live in relation to schools, parks, daycares, places that children congregate. And if you look at the picture up at the top, these laws have sort of become absurd. It says, Miami officials say sex offenders live too close to an island park because residence restrictions are based on as the crow flies, not necessarily if there's any barrier in the way. So there's a park on that island, and sex offenders can't live within 1,000 feet of that island. So what has happened is we now have sex offenders living under bridges because there's no place in Miami-Dade County where they can live without being in violation of residence restrictions. 22 states have these restrictions, and thousands of local jurisdictions have them as well. And what we know from the criminological literature is that stable housing, stable employment, and stable family and social relationships really help people desist from offending, and our laws are not really allowing for that. What I'm going to show you is an analysis that was done by colleagues of mine several years ago that sort of visualizes what happens with residence restrictions. So this is Newark, New Jersey. The red triangles are registered sex offenders, and the blue dots are places where children congregate, schools, parks, daycares. This is what happens when we put into effect 1,000-foot restrictions. So sex offenders can't live anywhere within those circles. This is what happens when we put in a 2,500-foot restriction. So we can basically legislate offenders out of communities. And many communities have done that, which just displaces these offenders, puts them at higher risk, and sends them to communities that don't have restrictions, in this case, New York City. And so we have no way to monitor their whereabouts. So again, the work that we've done looking at residence restrictions and transients really shows that sex offenders are at a much higher risk of being relegated into homelessness. And they are much more likely then to have registry violations when they're homeless. And there's this belief that registry violations equals more dangerous predators. We found that that's not the case. They are less likely to be predators, actually. They're less likely to have minor victims. And again, relegating people into homelessness destabilizes them and makes it more likely that they're going to offend. So our registration and notification system is effective. The vast majority of the literature that's out there says no, mostly because of the collateral consequences that these laws have. So again, inability to find adequate housing, inability to find a stable job, unstable family relationships. What my work has found, it built on the literature on collateral consequences, and what we found is that these collateral consequences cause negative emotions, so anger, stress, and strain. And I completely understand why people would say, well, we don't really care if sex offenders are feeling anger and stress or strain. But registered sex offenders report that when they feel this anger, that actually relates to offending in general ways, so violent crimes, drug crimes, and property crimes. And when they feel stress and strain because of these collateral consequences, then they often act out with sexual recidivism. And that makes a lot of sense because what we know from the literature is that the vast majority of people who commit sex crimes, particularly against children, do so because of the inability to cope with life stressors. If we're looking at a more macro level of whether or not these policies are effective, basically, we've found that by putting Megan's Law into place, there has been no decrease in the incidence of sexual violence. And study after study now have found that to be the case. So what this all means is that reactionary policies that are based on these few highly publicized heinous cases are really not effective in reducing sexual violence. And they may actually put us at more risk than protect us. That doesn't mean that registration and notification policies are not important policies to have if we use them in targeted ways. So states that use targeted policies, risk-based classification systems, actually do find positive effects. When we use them broadly, the way that many states do, and the way that Adam Walsh sort of forces us to do, doesn't work. Sex offenders do not fit a one-size-fits-all policy. We think of them as this homogenous group, but they really make up a very heterogeneous group of people with different risk factors and different reasons why they offend, and we did take that into account when we're thinking about this legislation. So the two main goals of these policies are public safety, which I've just shown you there's a body of literature that shows that it's not making us safe, and public outrage, this acknowledgement of the loss and the suffering to survivors of sexual violence. So it's one thing to acknowledge that, it's another to actually do something about it. Right? And what recent research is showing is that sex offender laws as we have them do not address the needs of survivors at all, right? So they're either not applicable or they negatively impact the lives of survivors, except for mandatory HIV testing. Again, these laws do not address the needs of survivors. The way the laws are written and the way that we talk about them in the media really misinforms the public. And I've seen that across the years that I've taught this class on sex offender policies and just in having conversations with people, right? The public is really misinformed about what sexual violence looks like, how people react, and what the policies should be to actually stop these crimes from occurring. It shifts the focus from the majority of offenses, the types of offenses that are occurring around us every hour of every day, and shifts it to the minority of cases that very seldom happen. So most survivors of sexual violence do not see a reflection of themselves in the laws that we put on the books. So if lawmakers really did want to help survivors, these are the types of things, these are the types of policies that we'd have in place. Free or affordable mental health services, right? Access to safe housing, comprehensive sex education, and information to give to the public that helps them to become aware of what sexual violence really looks like. And this idea of whole sight. Sexual violence doesn't just affect the survivor, it affects entire families, it affects entire communities. And as we decide that we want harsher laws, people are going to be less likely to report to law enforcement. And currently, fewer than 40% of people who experience sexual violence report. Primarily, people want abuse to stop. They don't necessarily want to see the perpetrator punished, and they want to have some type of control over the situation. So as we create harsher and harsher laws, fewer and fewer people will report. Again, that's not to say that we shouldn't have these policies. There's a place for registration and notification when we use it in an effective, evidence-based way. And saying this does not make me or my colleagues that I work with soft on sex crimes. It actually makes us really smart on sex crimes. We don't want the public to feel safe. We want the public to actually be safe. And to do that is to create harm reduction policies and prevention policies that seek to stop this type of violence before it ever happens, and to really focus on policies that reduce harm to survivors and provide access to care for survivors, their families, and for perpetrators.